Yeah,
Yeah.
and then it should, yep, there you
Yes,
go.
yes, yes. Yeah. So today we have Miss Jeannie with us, and she is Associate Vice Chancellor of Riverside University, California. Welcome, Jeannie. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm great. For our readers who will be seeing this interview and reading a small introduction of you, Shri is an anthropologist and have experience of more than 25 years in developing innovation communities, culture communities in higher education. She has delivered. She is a leader, and she is an expert in making leaders in education and have done a great work. And we really look up to her. And she will share much insights about how we can develop innovation communities inside our colleges in higher education and how that influence the society and altogether. So, Jenny, shall we start with things?
Sure.
Yeah. So, innovation, I think this word you have been associated with many of the years. Do you think are we losing this over a period of time in higher education globally?
So in terms of the innovation in higher education, I think that what we have been experiencing is sort of a revival in terms of how higher education is starting to look at innovation. Previously, innovation has not been something that has been synonymous with higher education, only because higher education has really been a cultural purveyor of maintaining the status quo here in the United States. I will say that that's not always been true in recent times for developing countries, though. So the work that I did in Cambodia, for instance, or with Laos and Vietnam even, and other areas around the world, I found that the developing countries that are really sort of reestablishing their systems are far more innovative and have a cutting edge to them, only because the times require it. Right? In order to be able to, in some ways, catch up to the first world countries, the best way to be able to address that is through higher education and education in general. And as a result, I found that the developing countries and those countries that may not have as robust a historical higher education system as the United States have really put everything forward in order to be able to, even in some cases, jump ahead of the United States in innovation. And I think that that's very telling in terms of where the US is and where the rest of the country is, or what rest of the world is in relation to innovation, and especially in places like India and Cambodia and other places like that.
So, in your opinion, developing countries are more good in terms of innovation?
In some ways, I think that they are. And the reason is because developing countries, so if you look at the history of South Korea, for instance,
Right.
so South Korea back 60, 70 years ago was a completely war-torn country. It was definitely a developing country. It had no infrastructure after the South Korean War and after all of the annexations and the basically just having been occupied for so long by a variety of different entities. And as a result, South Korea had to sort of redevelop its identity and figure out where it wanted to go. What they did was they really focused in on the education component, particularly higher education. And they had a very strategic vision of where it was that they wanted to land. And so that particular outcome drove everything that they did. And there was a strategy and a tactic for each of those different activities. And as a result, now just less than 100 years later, so 70 years later, we're looking at the conglomerations and the kind of presence that South Korean companies, South Koreans have, the kind of diplomacy that they have, their involvement in, space stations, all of those kinds of things is vastly different than what people would have expected 60 or 70 years ago from a very, very small war-torn country, right? That required innovation. That required different kind of thinking. It also required a plan and a strategy and an execution and a will by the people and the government to come together to make that so.
Right,
And
right.
I see that same kind of will and desire and the kind of strategy development happening in traditional developing countries. And part of it is because there is the sense of, if we are a global community. And I find that through the cultural components and the cultural exchanges that are taking place,
Mhm.
that developing countries have a bigger appetite for change.
Right.
There is a bigger appetite for new because they want to leapfrog in front of things and not necessarily go step by step by step. Here in the US, we are just now starting to think about these things in a leapfrog kind of a manner. Now, there are many universities that are a part of the innovation core, such as Arizona State University and a few others. But Arizona State, ASU, comes to mind the foremost because of the work that Michael Crow, their president, has been doing for over a decade now in the innovation sector and really pushing the envelope in so many different directions when it comes to higher education and innovation.
Right. So, in your opinion, how important are the innovations for any culture's development?
I think it's absolutely critical. Again, so it goes back to this idea that higher education in general, if you look at any kind of educational system in any culture, the education system is set up to actually maintain the status quo. And what I mean by that is that it's set up to actually keep the oppressed and those that are the haves and that have a lot of money or power or influence, etc., to keep them in power. That's what the actual structure of education is set up for. And the reason is because the people who are setting up these structures are those that are actually in power and influence, and therefore they're interested in maintaining the status quo, even though there are people within the education system that really want to be able to make change and create good and have the heart for making a difference in the world. That's not always the way that the actual structure and the foundation is set up. So what I call that is sort of the social reproduction of the social spheres instead of the cultural production where we're actually creating new within the structure of higher education or education in general. And so I think that for the innovations to really take place and for it to be grounded within the way that we structure education, we have to really look at why did we establish the educational structures? Who are we letting in? How are we helping them to be successful? Do they all have the same kinds of skill sets? Are we trying to create the same kinds of people or maintain the social structures and the strata? Or are we really trying to create opportunities for all different kinds of individuals, the diversity that the skill sets and their experiences that they bring to be able to create a different kind of world, a better world for everybody? We know through diversity research and everything else that diversity is critical to innovation, that diversity is critical to cultural development and innovation. And yet we don't necessarily set up our systems to ensure that we have diversity of all kinds at every level in what we do.
Right. So, cultural diversity, in your opinion, is one of the key for innovation?
Absolutely. I think that the diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of understanding are all really critical. And while in countries like in South Korea and in India and other places, it may seem like there is more homogeneity, the diversity of thought and experience and understanding are still very, very different. And so while the color of our skin may look relatively the same in some of these other kinds of situations, I think that it's really critical for us to be able to be really open about what does it mean to have a different experience, and how does that experience, that personal lived experience, make a difference in the way that we approach education or life or anything that we might do, business, etc. And again, we have not necessarily provided that experience, an opening for those kinds of conversations. And in India, part of this, the stratification is actually on a socioeconomic status, right? And that's very rigid. And so those kinds of pieces have to be dealt with straight, by looking at it very straight in the eye, but it's very culturally ingrained, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we really have to address. And it's similarly so in places like South Korea and in Japan. And so while there are these principles of wanting equality and equity, it's very, very hard to walk away from the existing social structures that actually keep those pieces all in place. And so dismantling those things requires real deliberate action. And that's not easy, but I think that's the role of education, and that's the role of innovation in higher education specifically.
Jenny, you are an expert in creating communities of innovation within bureaucratic and systematically entrenched organizational structure. 5 reasons one should initiate such communities in their institutions from your end.
Yeah, I think it goes back to my last comment about what I believe the role of higher education to be throughout the world. Higher education, in the US and actually throughout the world, was usually reserved for the elite, right? Only the elite, the Brahmins in India, were the ones that had access to higher education for a long period of time, right? And in the US, same, it was the clergy and those that had a lot of money that had access to higher education. That's all changed. And why was that the social structure that allowed higher education and access to higher education to only those elite becomes one of the question points, right? So in order to be able to have a change, we have to systematically look at, how do we actually, why were those things actually established, who had access, and how do we actually go about making these changes in a systematic manner? So, the primary reason, I would say the number one out of the 5, is because we want to be able to create more equality and equity within the way that we actually go about our social structure. If we are a global society, then that means that there is a place for every single individual within the global society. And it's a role of higher education to be able to create that space for every individual to be able to contribute productively to society and to be a part of that environment, right? And so that's number 1. Number 2 is that higher education has a role, has a responsibility to not only create that space, but to truly educate people so that we can be more accepting of the very differences that we actually have. And I want to say, in the past, people said, we want to tolerate differences. I'm so against that. It's not tolerating, it's acceptance, and it's respecting, and it's valuing the differences. That's a very, very different place from tolerating differences. And so I think that's part of the movement that we have to move forward in. And that's also one of the things that I see as being a key component for higher education. A third component, I would say, is we have a responsibility to be able to care for this world that we're in. And as higher education institutions, we have to work together through research, through different kinds of social and cultural activities to be able to really work simultaneously and synergistically with one another. And higher education is a great platform for being able to do that through the research activities, through student engagement, cross-pollination across various different institutions at all different levels, right? Not just the student experience, but with administrators, faculty, etc. And then the fourth component of it is an extension of that. It allows that higher education component. We are all a part of and embedded within our communities. And so by having us as individuals that are representing higher education being a part of that global community, we are now extending it to beyond just the higher education community. And so we become ambassadors, right? So we become ambassadors to our local communities, et cetera, and are able to broaden that network, making it a far more robust, supportive system where we really can work together for the good of humanity in general. And I would say the last reason is that piece around, the humanity component. Higher education has a responsibility, even as we develop all these technologies and we develop all the artificial intelligence and all these components that sort of make people pause because they think that the Matrix is going to come to life, or what was it, the Schwarzenegger movies, with all of those kinds of things are going to become reality. They could very well become reality, but the last piece is that it's the humanity piece of it. And I think higher education has a responsibility to remind people that we are humans. As much as we're developing all of this cutting edge technology components, at the end of the day, we cannot replicate human beings and our minds the way that humans are actually structured, no matter how much we do the cloning or anything else. Humans are humans and we are unique. And we have to remember, and I think that's where we're turning right now with all of the research around emotional intelligence, understanding what it means to be human within the artificial intelligence age. What are the things that are uniquely human versus what is artificially intelligent when you've got robots that look just like us, and virtual reality and all of those different components. I'm a big fan of fantasy and sci-fi novels, etc. And so I do quite a bit of reading in that arena. And all of that dystopic future that people always imagine is such a negative arena. And part of it is because we're so afraid, right? So higher education and education, I think, is really about putting the humanity piece forward and telling people that there is hope, because we want to be able to create that better community. And I think that's a very unique human quality that we all strive towards. And we have a responsibility to be able to build that into the education system.
Right. So I really like the fifth point as you elaborated it as a piece, and somewhere on globally, I think all across the world, we all are losing the main essence of being educated. Yes, we all are educated, but somehow we, how advanced we got, how many advancements we have in technology in terms of robots or in AI and in many other things. But yes, we need, an ultimate goal is to maintain peace and equality in the whole culture on the globe. So yes, is I think the most important point we all should keep in mind. So
Absolutely.
exactly. So if anyone want to initiate it in any of the university or higher education institute, how they can do that?
In terms of the innovation component, or in terms of any of this stuff, yeah. I think that one is to do it by deliberate design at every level. So meaning the curriculum needs to be looked at first and foremost. And the faculty are the ones that are the purveyors of that curriculum, right? They're the responsible parties and they're developing it. So we need to look at the curriculum and see if we are really providing opportunities for people to truly be creative, to use the human spirit to drive the way that we learn, the way that we absorb information, and to teach according to that. And not just do it from a teacher-centered perspective, but from a student-centered perspective. Right. So we all have limited capacity to actually absorb information. And yet at the same time, when we're doing teaching and in traditional teaching, it's literally open up the lid, try to pour in as much as you possibly can, and then see if they can actually remember it and tell it back to you. That's not really learning, but that has been the traditional model of learning, right? And so I think that the key is really to try to figure out how can we help each individual create the architecture in their heads the mental models that we all walk around with that create our biases, how do we actually teach people how to suspend those mental models? So I think that the teaching environment and the curriculum can help students to really understand, what is it that I'm learning? Where am I actually putting that information? How does it relate to what I already know? How will it relate to something that I'm going to learn in the future? And I think the role of education is to help connect those pieces for the student so that they can practice that. That is actually learning. And that's going to create creativity, and it will also bring the student into that picture, and it's not a unidirectional kind of a learning environment, right? So we talk about it here in the US as asset-based learning, so that we're talking about the strengths that the student might have. We also talk about it as a way for the student to be much more culturally aware of what it is that they're bringing to the table. And I think that those are really critical in terms of how we look at education. So I think the very first step is really looking at the curriculum, how we're delivering it, what we're actually teaching, and being very deliberate and intentional about what we want in terms of those outcomes.
Right. You are a global speaker and delivered many lectures all across globe in many countries. So, what general hurdles people discussed with you? They felt while in maybe at level of professors or level of vice chancellors, or it may be level of administration. What major hurdles they feel when they want to change things and make it for a better perspective?
Yeah, the biggest change is actually ourselves. I mean, biggest hurdle to change is ourselves.
Okay.
um, and the reason is because if you look at any structure, and when we think about change, we have to change in order for us to be able to change the structure. We have to have a different mindset first. We have to adopt and accept first. And we have to be the examples of that change in very consistent ways. That's a very, very difficult thing for people to do. And so it requires a lot of self-reflection. So for example, when I speak with people, or when I was doing the global speaking and talking with educators in lots of different countries, Russia, Japan, Cambodia, Korea, what the biggest stumbling block was, well, why do I have to change? So I would get that from faculty members, from administrators, et cetera. Why do I have to change my perspective on X? And I would say, well, you want your students to change their perspectives and learn these different things. So why are you not learning alongside them? They have something to contribute to you as well. They have a fund of knowledge that they need to transfer to you as well, so that you can become a better educator, a better teacher. That was a relatively foreign concept to people. And I think that that's one of the biggest travesties about education is that we've set up education as if there are these experts, and those experts know everything. And that's just not true, especially in today's society. Today's global society, and with the access of the internet and everything else, the knowledge that's really at our fingertips, the knowledge piece is not about the content necessarily. We can find content everywhere, right? The knowledge and the teaching piece is, how do we put those pieces together so that we can actually make a difference for whatever it is that we're working on? How do we teach people to continue to be learners, to want to be able to learn, and then take that information to create something unique, something different, something beneficial to society, or a technology, or whatever the case is, a business, new knowledge. But that requires us, again, looking at what it is that we're trying to convey. Are we putting ourselves first in that, or are we really keeping the student first in mind? And that's, I think, the fundamental difference and the fundamental hurdle as well.
So, any of the experience you want to share with us? Maybe can be of a benefit for our audience to listen about, and they can learn a good thing from that.
Yeah, so I guess that in terms of experiences, I would actually really encourage people to sort of step outside of their comfort zone. So one of the talks that I just recently gave was on networking. And how to be able to establish networks, how to grow your network, and why that's so important. And the basic concept of networks is that you have strong ties and you have weak ties, right? So the strong ties are those individuals that you know pretty closely, that you hang out with on a regular basis. It can be a personal circle, it can be a work circle, etc. But it's a relatively tight unit, and everybody has multiple connections to one another. And oftentimes those can be closed networks. There may not be additional people that are broader in that network. Loose ties are really like our tie. We met through LinkedIn, and which LinkedIn is a great example of the strength of weak ties component, where you've got lots of people connected to one another. We don't necessarily know one another very, very well, but we know that there are ways that we can connect with each other, and there's value in that network. So the strength of those weak ties is something to be cultivated. So just as similarly as you all reached out to me and said, Jeannie, would you be a part of this? There's value in that, because there's a way to be able to do this social sharing and to be able to get outside of our normal comfort zones, to get messages across that we typically would not have been able to get across, right? And so I challenge people to, when you go to a networking event, or if you go to a new country, go out and do something completely different. Put yourself out there so that you're just a little bit uncomfortable, because that uncomfort or discomfort is a sign that you're doing something that's outside of your norm, and it makes your awareness level much more heightened, and you're able to develop new skill sets. And that broadening helps us to be able to be more receptive to change and to being able to adopt and adapt to new situations. And it's a practice area. So that would be the one thing that I would actually encourage everybody to do.
Right. Great. So I think from your end, it's a mantra. So step a little bit out of your comfort zone. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, nope, I'm here.
Okay, I thought it's just a concession in the network. So yeah, your mantra can be like step out of your comfort zone, and the world is great and waiting for you to share his knowledge with you.
Yes.
Exactly. So what do you think of Edvoice as an initiative? I'm very curious.
I think it's, yeah, it's incredible. You guys have really sort of galvanized a lot of thought and thinking around where higher education and education in India should go. I think this is one of the first times that I've actually seen a total kind of a platform where you're bringing in so many different voices and just opening up this whole world of education and higher education across the entire country, right? Which is pretty phenomenal. And you guys are a big continent. There's a lot of people in India. There's a lot of reach that needs to happen too. And very similar to how the US was, you've got lots of different kinds of pockets. You've got people that are very, very socioeconomically viable, very wealthy, have all kinds of connections. I have had the privilege of having lots of Indian friends. And they have been at all different levels of the strata. And, but what I found is that India has become more and more open, but not in all areas, right? So depending on which country or part of the country you're in, you can have different kinds of experiences. But what I know about India is that it's a country that's very hungry. And there have been lots of things that have been tried in India that have not been tried in other places. And India has been very receptive to that. So it's a time and an opportunity where something like EduVoice is going to have huge impact, because people are hungry for that information and for something that's relatively curated, that's focused on how do you actually make education better. And you all are focused on creating the building blocks so that education and educators are able to really leapfrog and jump ahead of that line. everybody that I've worked with from India have been incredibly talented and gifted and so intelligent. And it's been really amazing to sort of watch. So I've worked with um, folks that are British but have roots in India, right? They are some of the best female CEOs, rock stars that are out there. I had a grad student who came from India when I was at another institution, and he was my computer science person and actually took care of a lot of what was it? He was setting up some systems for me on SQL Server and things like that. Things that back then, this was 15 years ago, maybe longer, people didn't know anything about. But he, as a student, knew about it because he had been trained so well in India, right? So I think that EduVoice is really timely. There were, like I said, all these pockets in India previously, but they weren't necessarily connected. And I think you all can be that galvanizing voice and bring people together for conversations, very, very rich conversations that India has not had the opportunity to enjoy at this point. But there's so much great work that's happening, and I think you guys are definitely going to be at the forefront of some great and terrific conversations.
Thank you so much. I would love to have you on our advisory panel, Jenny. So please share me your thought about that.
The advisory
Of EduVoice.
committee? Oh, yeah, sure. I would definitely be very glad to participate in that. I have not had the privilege of going to India yet, but it's definitely on my list to go to India at some point. So I would love to be a part of the advisory board, and maybe there would be a way to be able to connect in person.
Sure. So I'll ask my colleague to share a formal email for the acceptance of our advisory panel, and you'll be on board then.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Terrific.
I'm really happy to have you on board now. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and it was an amazing discussion and a very new, different domain of education. I have seen, I think, from your viewpoint, because we all are running towards higher education in maybe a domain like yes, we need to change the strategy, how people should learn about. But obviously, yes, we are somewhere lacking our culture things. But I think, yes, that need to be focused upon again.
Yeah, and I think that I think one of the things that you might just take a caution on is so I'm a cultural anthropologist, right? So my perspective is always to value the culture that we're in. So don't throw out Indian culture or even local culture in the various different locations throughout India. Always value the culture component, because that's part of our identity. Right. And it's really critical to how we approach things. So what I've seen in other areas, like when I worked in Cambodia and stuff, people were so eager to cast off the Cambodian identity and just adopt the American identity. And that's not the way to move things forward. We want to make sure and preserve the culture that you're in, and because there's so much value and richness there, and that's where the diversity comes from. So we can drop all these ideas in, but because your culture is different, because your experiences are different, it's going to grow in a different way. And that's the true value of what I think education is about. And we have to nurture that, not make everything equal and same. And, that's actually really not the point.
So, see you soon in India. Please make some good plans. I'll have a good list for you once you visit India. Let's meet soon.
Okay.
Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, bye. Have a good night.